Hello and welcome to SRIRAM's IAS, a leading teaching and training institution that is teaching young adults who aspire to join the civil services. I'm very happy to welcome one of India's leading economists, and we are going to discuss the current state of India's economy after the COVID pandemic. So let me welcome Dr. Pronob Sen. Dr. Pronob Sen is the former Chief Statistician of India. He was a former chairman of the National Statistical Commission. He worked for a decade and a half with the erstwhile Planning Commission, which is today called the Niti Aayog. And he wrote 3 5-year plans: the 9th 5-year plan, the 10th 5-year plan, and the 12th 5-year plan. Dr. Pronob Sen he was educated in Delhi and in the United States. He has a PhD degree from Johns Hopkins University in the United States, and he also has a master's in business administration from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. in the United States. He had got his bachelor's degree from St. Stephen's College. Thank you so much, Dr. Sen, for giving us your time. So let's start with the first concept of what is the GDP, gross domestic product, and to what extent does the size of the GDP and the rate of growth of the GDP reflect economic well-being, economic development? That's my first question to you for our young adults who are listening to you.
Well, let me begin by dispelling a sort of a misnomer that exists in the term GDP. So as you rightly said, GDP stands for gross domestic product. Now everybody uses the term to mean the total amount of production that is taking place in an economy. But that is wrong. It is not. The GDP actually is a measure of the total aggregate incomes that are being generated. Now, incomes and production are very different things. So if you think of any manufacturing activity, let us say, a manufacturer will buy raw materials and spare parts from somebody else, will then apply capital and labor, and will convert it into a finished product and will then sell it in the market. So the income that is being generated in that activity is the difference between the price that he gets for his finished product and the amount he has paid for buying the raw materials and intermediates. Okay, that is the income. So when you add up all these incomes across the economy, what you get is the GDP. Now, if you think about the GDP as a measure of income, then it should be pretty clear that you can measure GDP in various ways. The first way of measuring GDP is to do exactly what I said, is you go by production activity, find out what is the income that is being generated in each unit, and you add that up. The second way is to look directly at the income of different human beings in the country. Add them up. You'll get GDP. The third is, since all income is spent one way or another, whether it is spent in consumption or in investment, you can look at it in terms of how much consumption is taking place or how much investment is taking place. So you have 3 ways of measuring GDP, and it essentially comes out of this definition, which is GDP is the aggregate measure of income, and income earned and income spent are going to be equal. So that is the concept of GDP. So it's a concept of incomes and not of production per se.
Dr. Sen, there are, as you rightly pointed out, there are various ways we can measure gross domestic product or national income, if you like. And what does it leave out? Does it say for these leave out unpaid labor? If a woman is taking care of an elderly person or a child, that doesn't come into the GDP. So many people argue that the gross domestic product or a GDP does not include many activities which are economically useful, add to the well-being of human beings and society as a whole. So look at me when you talk and you explain to me why is GDP perhaps not such an accurate measure of economic development or well-being in a society?
No, it is not an inaccurate measure of the overall level of income in the society. Now, the examples you gave are what are referred to as the production of services for self-consumption. Now, how are you going to distinguish between a product or a service that you are producing for your own consumption or for sale? So, for instance, if a lady puts on a makeup, right, is that adding to income? It could have. She could have gone to a beauty parlor and paid somebody for it. But is she doing it? Or is she getting a benefit out of the act of doing her own makeup? So the GDP includes everything, including the production of goods for own consumption, because they can potentially be sold to somebody else, but not services for self-consumption. It leaves that part out. Now, whether it's a good measure of well-being, the GDP, as I said, is an aggregate measure. It's a total. What it does not tell is who is getting that income. So if you think about any economic system, it comprises of human beings. Now, it may well be the case that one person in that economy gets the entire GDP, right? Now, that would be, and even if the GDP is very high, the level of welfare in that economy would be terrible. Alternatively, the same level of GDP could be distributed equally among all the people. Now, that would be a much better state of affairs. GDP in itself does not tell you that.
Okay.
That is, does not tell you who is getting that.
Correct. So in other words, as an aggregate measure, it tells you the total, but it doesn't tell you how that income has been distributed within a society.
That's right.
So let's look a little bit about GDP growth rates. It seems to be so important, especially for political leaders, to keep emphasizing GDP growth, that we have grown so much in this quarter or so much in this year, and we are going to grow at this space in the coming future, and India's GDP will be so many, 5 trillion US dollars. So these kinds of measures, as you pointed out, are not, don't tell you the full story. Let's then look at GDP growth rates. Why are these become so important, especially for our political leaders?
No, it's not just our political leaders. This is important for every political leader, because the GDP measures the size of the cake, which can then be distributed among all the people in the country. Okay? Now, if the cake itself is not growing, then if you try to make one person better off, you're going to necessarily make somebody else worse off. So the growth of GDP is a measure of the rate at which that cake is growing, and therefore the extent to which you can transfer incomes from the rich to the not so rich. That's why the growth rate is so important.
Okay. Dr. Sen, in the recent past, there have been some controversies about how GDP growth is to be measured. There were instances where the base year was changed, and there were instances of how certain items were omitted or calculated in a different manner, including, say, the contribution that companies make to GDP. Would you like to explain, since you were the head of the National Statistical Commission and you were the Chief Statistician of India, what these controversies were all about, and to what extent we could move towards a system where we avoid the kinds of controversies that we've seen over the last few years?
Okay, so let's talk about what existed earlier first. Earlier, what we used to do is that we would, in any given base year, we would actually measure how much income was being generated per unit of output of a full range of products. We measured it in 1 year, right? So what you had was what's called the value added to output ratio. In subsequent years, what you did was you assumed that that ratio remained constant and you measured only the production. As I said, GDP is not production. So GDP is a part of that production. And so what you would do, you would measure production and you would multiply that production by the value added to production ratio that you had calculated earlier at one time, and then added it up. Okay. Now, this is the way we were doing it all the way up to 2011-12. This has one very big disadvantage. And that disadvantage is that if there is an improvement in the productive efficiency of that company, that is, it is generating more output from the same amount of inputs, this method would not capture it until you did that survey again and change the value added to production ratio. Now that would happen 5, 7, 8 years later. The method that is being used now is that the CSO is directly using company balance sheet data.
When you say CSO, you mean the Central
Statistical Office,
which comes under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation.
That is correct.
Please continue.
Now, when you're getting the balance sheet data, the balance sheet is giving you for every year how much is the value of the output and how much is the value of the inputs. And you can actually calculate the income generated within that company directly. Right? So if there has been an efficiency improvement, then you are picking that up, which you are not picking up earlier. Now, what this will do is that when you have an economy in which productive efficiency is improving, the new method of calculating GDP will actually increase the growth rate because efficiency is improving. Now, that was where the controversy came, because people said, look, it's the same production, but how come GDP is growing faster? And the answer is because the production efficiencies were and continue to improve in the Indian system.
Dr. Sen, one of the big challenges of calculating GDP as well as calculating rates of growth of GDP is that India has a very large informal sector. And yes, you have a relatively small formal sector. You can call it organized and unorganized. You know, I mean, people say over 90% of those who are employed in this country, they are not in the organized sector. They're not in the formal sector. They're in agriculture. They are in the so-called unorganized or informal sector. Now, although this sector would account for perhaps 90% or thereabouts of the total number of people who are employed in the country or self-employed, the problem is that how do you actually estimate their contribution to the GDP? Now, there are various estimates. One of them says they are somewhere in the region of about half of your GDP or 45% or 50%. So it's a huge component of the GDP. Now, the way you sort of extrapolate is on the basis of surveys that take place every 5 years or thereabouts. So this becomes a huge area of contention and controversy because we are perhaps not able to estimate properly the contribution of the informal sector to the economy, to GDP. Please explain
No,
and
that is
elaborate.
that is correct. But you're right. The figures are that I don't call it the informal sector. I call it the non-formal sector because it's not necessarily informal. Accounts for about 85% of employment and about 45% of GDP. So roughly that's the breakup. Of this 45%, about 17% is agriculture. Now, agriculture is actually measured very well. There are systems in place where on a crop-wise basis, agricultural estimates are made, and that system works rather well. So what we are looking at is about 28% of non-agricultural GDP, which is coming essentially from the non-formal, non-agricultural sector. That's where the problem lies that you're talking about. So the magnitude is somewhat small. Now, there are various ways that this can be done. The way it is done at the moment is, well, again, let me go back to the past to tell you the sort of improvement that has happened. Earlier, what would be done is every 5 years, there would be a large-scale survey of non-formal units. And the estimates for the non-formal sector were built up from those surveys, and those were very accurate. What would be done then is that whatever was the growth rate between one survey and the next would then be extrapolated into the future until the third survey took place, right? And then corrections would be made. What is done today is that it has been found that the non-formal sector under normal circumstances has roughly the same rate of growth as the smaller units in the formal sector. Not the large ones, but the smaller ones. So what is done now is to use the balance sheet data of the smaller non-formal, smaller formal companies.
I'm just interrupting you here. Most of these would be small and medium enterprises, or even the micro enterprises, or cottage.
No, there are micro enterprises who do have balance sheet data. So any micro enterprise that actually borrows from MFI, the microfinance institutions, is required to maintain data. So some of the data is available. So you use the data for these small units and you work out what the growth rate is, and you apply that growth rate to the survey estimate of the non-formal sector. That's the method that's used now. Now, this works rather well. In fact, it works better than the earlier system in normal times. But when times are not normal, where you know for theoretical reasons that the non-formal and the formal are behaving differently, then this is a bad way of doing things. And there are two instances where this is true. The first one was the demonetization. As we all know, it was the non-formal sector which is predominantly cash-based, and it was hurt much worse than the formal sector, which was mostly non-cash in terms of its transaction. So the two were diverging. But the GDP estimates continue to behave as if the two were moving together. That was a problem. That's a problem we are having today as well. In the COVID situation, the lockdown has actually affected the non-formal much more than it has affected the foreign.
All right. I'm going to ask you to talk in greater detail and expand on what is happening today post-COVID and the impact of the COVID pandemic on the economy. But before that, I want to take you up on another point, on a point that you mentioned, and I want to talk about a few other issues. The issue, you said demonetization. It's almost 3 years now. It happened in November 2016. Sorry, it's going to be 4 years. I beg your pardon. It's more than 3.5 years. In November 2016, the government decided to demonetize over 85%, roughly 86% of all the currency in circulation, the high denomination notes. As you rightly pointed out, this had an impact on that segment of the economy, which was cash dependent. And that includes the informal sector, it includes agriculture, etc. But I'm saying, former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh said this has resulted in a 2 percentage point drop in the GDP. But this didn't get reflected. Would you like to elaborate on why the official statistics of the government of India pertaining to GDP apparently did not reflect the impact of demonetization on the economy?
The reason is exactly what I said, that the system is estimating the informal sector by using the growth rate of the formal sector. Now, during demonetization, the formal sector actually did reasonably well. It was the informal sector, which was cash dependent, which got badly hurt. Now, when they calculated the GDP, they took the growth rate of the formal sector and applied it to the informal sector as well, thereby overstating the growth hugely. Now, what Dr. Manmohan Singh is saying is that the informal sector probably recorded negative growth. But what you were showing was the informal sector recording positive and fairly high growth. So if you remember, the year after demonetization had the highest growth in the previous 5 years.
That seemed to defy logic.
It does. And that is precisely why you need to understand the manner in which the GDP estimates are made.
Okay. Dr. Sen, there is another aspect which other economists, including economists like Dr. Arun Kumar, point out, that what the government statistics do not factor in is the black money, the illegal transactions that take place, the so-called off-balance sheet transactions that take place. Now, people like Professor Arun Kumar, they've been working on this subject for a long time, and they believe that the size of India's black economy is huge. And at points of time, he's argued that it could be half of what your GDP is. So if your actual GDP today is supposed to be 200 lakh crores, if you add all the black money in it, the stock, and not just the flow, that number would be far, far higher. What are your views on this aspect of the economy and calculating the gross domestic product?
No, I think Arun Kumar has been overstating the problem. The way GDP is measured actually does capture this information, which is why you see a disconnect between GDP estimates and tax estimates. The problem is that the tax people are not getting this information. But the way GDP is calculated is that at the end of the day, remember, everything must add up. So somebody's output must be somebody's purchase. So when you're working from both ends and you finally reconcile it, you are probably capturing most of those activities, except for what I would estimate is a fairly small amount. I would imagine it would be somewhere between 8 to 10% of GDP, not very much more than that. So the figures that Arun gives, which is 45%, 50% higher, I think is an overstatement. What he is picking up is a lot of transactions which are cash-based. Now, cash-based transactions are not necessarily black. So agriculture, for instance, is non-taxed. All right? Now, if it is not taxed, but it cannot be black, the income that is being generated.
Okay. In other words, what you're saying, even if India's so-called parallel economy, so-called black economy, so-called unaccounted economy is not as high as some people have made it out to be, you are nevertheless saying that it could be 10%. It could be a little more
Yeah,
than 10% also. So if
that's right.
indeed our the estimate of the gross domestic product for the financial year that ended on the 31st of March 2020 would be say 200 lakh crore, that should have actually been perhaps 220 or 230 lakh crores. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay, so let's look a little bit at what the impact of the COVID pandemic and the lockdown of the economy, which really started on the night of the 24th and the 25th of March, and which led to an unprecedented migration of people from urban areas to rural areas, and it resulted in a shutdown of large sections of the economy. And as we talk on the last day of July, the impact on the economy isn't over. Large sections, the urban areas, other parts of the country remain under different stages of that lockdown. The economic activities are very slow. So I would like you to elaborate what is the current state of the economy. What is the current state of the economy post-COVID lockdown?
Well, yeah, I think let's begin from 25th March. 25th March, the lockdown was national. That's why it has caught attention. What a lot of people miss is that various states had actually locked down prior to the 25th, for almost 2 weeks prior to the 25th. So if you're thinking about economic effects, you need to take that into account as well. But let's restrict our focus to what happened from 25th March onwards. Now, between 25th March and 1st of June, what we had is somewhere between 50 to 55% of the Indian economy simply not producing at all. Now, when you add up the numbers, what it comes to during this period of national lockdown, what it comes to is roughly, we were losing about 2 lakh crore rupees, 2 lakh crore rupees per week.
Or 8 lakh a month, and in a 3-month period, it's roughly 24 lakh or 25 lakh.
It's less than 3. It's less than 3 months, about 2.5 months. We are talking somewhere around 20 lakh crores, which is about 10% of our annual GDP. Annual, right?
So you're comparing a 2.5 month period with say a period which is 12 months. Yes, please
12
continue.
months.
Please continue.
Right? Post June, what has happened is that the national lockdown has been lifted, but all kinds of constraints have been brought in to the way in which production units function. So you had restrictions on how many workers there could be on the shop floor. And there was a time it began with saying you cannot have more than 1/3 the number of workers. Now, the problem there is that supposing it was 1/3 and we were doing 3 shifts, the company could possibly produce exactly how much it was producing if it were producing on a single shift basis earlier. The problem is we don't know this, what companies have done. But what we can expect is by and large, the companies would be producing, even after the lockdown was lifted, significantly below their capacities. This we do know. Now, this has lasted from the beginning of June right up to now, which is 2 months have passed. So each unit is actually operating below its capacity. Then to that, you add the problem that various state governments have been putting in localized lockdowns, which may not affect production that much, but what it certainly has affected very severely is what's called the supply chain, which is movement of goods from one factory to another and from the factory to the retail. Now, supply chain disruptions create a huge amount of problem because the producer does not know that if he produces, whether he will be able to move it to the retail outlet where he sells his product. And so he will hold back his production deliberately until he's certain that the product can be moved.
Please continue. Sorry for the disruption.
Right. So as I said, we experienced about 20 lakh crore worth of damage when the national lockdown was on. But subsequent to that, we are experiencing further damage. Nobody has an exact measure of that, but one can easily imagine in the last 2 months, it would be another 6 to 8 lakh crores. But this is only the beginning. Even after all lockdown is lifted, there is going to be a few effects which will linger. The first and most obvious is that the rest of the world is in the same shape that we are in, which means our exports are going to be adversely affected, which then in turn means that companies which were producing for exports, and remember there's a lot of MSMEs who depend on exports for their sales, they will not have a market to sell to. So that's going to have another depressive effect, but that's going forward. The other effect that, again, people are ignoring is that if we have lost essentially 26 or 28 lakh crores worth of income, surely our consumption will be lower than what it would have been otherwise.
In other words,
when my consumption is lower, it means that the units cannot produce to capacity because the demand doesn't exist, which means that the income damage continues to happen. Until the units come to full production, there will always be income loss because you're not employing all the people and you're not producing to capacity. So this is called the multiplier effect, and this multiplier effect can play itself out over a 1.5 to 2 year period. So if anybody thinks that the effect is going to end once lockdown is fully gone, they are wrong. The effects are going to continue to play out into the next year as well.
For instance, I'm interrupting you. For instance, if you look at particular sectors of the economy, say travel, say tourism, hospitality, they are substantial employment generators. Now, these particular sectors of the economy, retail, have been devastated after the nationwide lockdown and the continuing lockdown in different parts of the country, which has been implemented by different states. So you are now arguing that these sectors, which have been virtually shut down in many areas, will take quite some time to revive and return to the old levels, pre-COVID levels.
My estimate is that unless the government takes much stronger measures than it has done to date, it could take up to 4 years.
Okay, so when you look at, if you are really talking about 25 lakh crores, you are looking at India's GDP in the current financial year, which starts on the 1st of April and ends on the 31st of March 2021. It could shrink by over 10%. So if your earlier
Right.
GDP was 200 lakh crores and you're down by 25 lakh crores, that's well over 10%. That's possibly closer to about 11% or thereabouts. So you think that's the kind of shrinkage of the Indian economy that is likely to take place in the current financial year that we talk about, that we are in at present.
That is correct. That we are talking about, what we are looking at the moment is the possibility of a double-digit shrinkage.
Dr. Sen, what is recession? You know, how do you measure recession? The Americans or the West have a way of measuring recession, that it is supposed to be negative growth in 2 successive quarters. That's one
That is
definition.
right.
Others would say a recession is you know, you can interpret it very, very differently. Secondly, what is a depression? When recession goes on for several years. Now, nobody actually has these very, very clear or precise definitions of what is a recession, what is the depression. But there is a general consensus. The figures put out by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, among others, all say that the world economy is going to shrink. The world is in a recessionary stage. And I would like you to talk about what is likely to happen in India.
Well, the definition of a recession is exactly what it is. This is now the agreed upon definition of a recession. So when anybody talks about a recession, they are essentially talking about 2 consecutive quarters of negative.
6 months of negative growth.
6 months of negative. Okay?
And
we are there.
We are sort of 4 months into that.
We are
April, May, June, July.
April, May, June, July.
And July.
4 months into that.
Yeah.
Yeah. The likelihood is we will certainly be in a recession. A depression is 2 consecutive years of negative growth. Okay? Now, the point I was trying to make was that if the recovery process does not scale up sufficiently, we may actually be looking at negative growth next year as well. This is a real possibility. Everything depends upon, number one, how quickly the disease itself is contained. Whether through vaccines or it goes away by itself, we do not know when things can come back to normal. Because the longer it plays out, the longer will be these localized lockdowns and the disruptions that are taking place, and the longer will the multiplier effects last. The second is the feedback effect that we are going to get from the rest of the world, which faces exactly the same problem as we do. So if exports continue to go downwards, then that's going to add to our recessionary trends, and therefore, and the recession could then slip into a depression if next year becomes negative growth as well.
Okay, Dr. Sen, before I discuss a few issues relating to the relief package that was announced by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, I want you to elaborate on one specific aspect of the problem that we've faced in the last few months, and that is internal migration. Many believe that the kind of internal migration that we have witnessed starting from really late March till now is unprecedented. Certainly in India, people say during the partition in the subcontinent between 1943-44 all the way up to 48, about 1.5 crores, 15 million people, they were internally displaced, and that too largely from the Punjab and the Bengal, the erstwhile undivided Bengal. What we have seen today is larger numbers of people, except that there have been migration within the country. Now, there have always been migration. There have also been seasonal migration and also other kinds of migration, especially for, say, the construction industry. And we saw certain parts of India that the labor would move out of. say Eastern India, Jharkhand, Bihar, West Bengal, Assam, Chhattisgarh, Orissa. And there would be certain parts of India where the labor would uh, move towards Punjab and Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, Western Uttar Pradesh and Gujarat, and even within states, say like a state like Maharashtra, you'd see internal migration from the rural areas to the urban areas. Now, what we've actually seen in the months, the last week of March onwards, till April, May, and June was unprecedented. This never happened, perhaps, I would argue, in the history of humankind. What are your views, and what impact has this internal migration had, or is having, or is its impact on the economy?
Well, let's be very clear about a few things. The migration that we have witnessed is the direct outcome of the fact that the unemployment in urban areas shot up. So what you are seeing essentially was not the rural to rural migrants from who are going to Punjab, Haryana, West UP, or Andhra Pradesh for that matter. These were relatively permanent migrants who had moved for purposes of either manufacturing or construction or a whole host of other services. They were more or less regular residents of urban areas. These were the people who were moving back. The temporary migration that takes place actually comes after. So those people had not moved to Punjab or Haryana yet, because the harvest season comes a little later. So you had the problem of the Punjab and Haryana farmers not having enough labor to cut their crops. But what we are looking at is people who over years, gradually, relatively smooth flow of people from various parts of the country to various other parts of the country who are semi-permanently settled there. They had lost their livelihoods and they were coming back home. Now, the really interesting issue out here is, why were they coming back home? And this is a peculiar characteristic of Indian migration. Unlike migration in other countries where entire families move, in India, by and large, you do have, of course, some cases where the whole family moves.
But by and large, largely males.
It is that the family stays at home, and it's the males who move, and the families are supported by their men who are working in urban areas, who send back remittances for support of the families. And those remittances are fairly large. Just if you think about the numbers we are talking about. Now, it's these people who are moving. So for them, home is where the family is, which is in the village. They were moving back home. The point is that in the village, whether or not they would have the ability to eke out a living is really the question. These people moved out because there wasn't enough work or enough income in the villages for them to have stayed back. Now that they've gone back, what has happened is two things. Number one, and most important, is that the remittances which were supporting the rural economy have practically dried up. And these were, remember, large amounts. So although agriculture has done well, rural incomes have not done that well, because remittances are part of rural incomes. Number two, what has happened is that a large number of people are now consuming in rural areas while they were consuming in urban areas before. So the overall number of people in rural areas has gone up.
Okay.
So that's a double whammy. Incomes have come down, number of people have gone up.
So these are very, very important developments and trends that we've seen. If we can talk a little bit about the issue of unemployment and underemployment. Now, we know that the government has this periodic labor survey, and there was a huge controversy because there were two members of the National Statistical Commission who resigned in protest because of the government's refusal to release the data. And the government says, though, the data is incomplete, it's not final, don't compare apples with oranges. Finally, when the data was released, it was not very different from what the original survey was. Except one was before the election and the other was after the election. And what the figures showed was pretty hard. I mean, what should I say? It was very, very damaging. I mean, it says that the unemployment rate in India had shot up to its highest level in 45 years. Now, that is obviously not something anybody in power would, like to publicize. But the point is, in certain respects, things are worse. Now, we don't have the periodic labor survey. We instead have the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, and it says that what really happened in April was a huge jump in unemployment, and something in the region, the figure was about 24%. I mean, you're saying 1 out of 4 Indians were without work, without jobs. And when you look at the number of people who were part of the labor participation rate, I mean, that too had shot up. So I want
Shut down.
I beg your pardon, had come down. Therefore, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the controversies in the past about estimating employment, unemployment, and what has actually happened to the employment situation post-COVID and lockdown.
Well, again, in the past, because the Indian labor data didn't seem to change very much over time. So if you looked at the unemployment rate starting from the 1970s, it used to hang around 2.5%, and give 0.2, 0.3 this side or that side, but never cross 3%. Now, because of that, the labor force surveys should be done only once every 5 years. And that was not to check on employment, but to check in what sectors were they working. So it was more a sectoral issue rather than unemployment issue that was being measured. When the reason PLFS was brought in was the recognition that the employment situation in India has become much more volatile post-liberalization, and we needed annual information to be able to handle that. More importantly, the labor force situation in urban areas was even more volatile because people were constantly coming in and out of the urban labor force, which is why the PLFS was designed to be annual for rural areas where this change is relatively small, and quarterly for urban areas, because the urban labor market is much more dynamic. The problem that has cropped up is that the Ministry of Statistics released the 17-18 PLFS numbers. So
the periodic labor force survey. Yes.
So this was for 17-18, where the unemployment rate had doubled to 6.1%. After that, I do not know the pressures that have been brought, but the regular release of the quarterly urban labor force survey has simply not been happening. If it had been happening, we would have had a much better sense of where we are at present. Now, the end result is, at the moment, we are relying on the CMIE data. Now, the CMIE data, unfortunately, has a serious problem, which is that the CMIE data works with a fixed sample. In that it has identified a fixed set of households whom they visit repeatedly, the same households. Right? Now, this is divided into two groups, urban and rural. Now, in a situation where you see such large reverse migration, what has ended up happening is that a lot of people who are in the urban sample no longer are there. They have moved back into the rural areas. But in the rural sample, they will not come because only the people who are in rural areas earlier are included in that sample. So given the magnitude of the migration that we are talking about, the CMI data has become actually somewhat unreliable.
Okay.
So we don't have the PLFS data and we have a CMI data which is required.
So I actually will be speaking to Mr. Mahesh Vyas, who is the managing director of the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy. And I'll surely ask him this question and get his response to what you have said. If we can talk a little bit about the relief package. You know, the government said 20 lakh crore. And this is like 10% of India's GDP. But once you start sort of breaking down those numbers, you find that a very, very substantial part of it were not only old schemes which had been repackaged, there were existing schemes that had been included, but the additional part of it, the additionality in terms of extra that the Prime Minister's Anna, Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, where you are giving free food grain, 5 kilograms of either rice or wheat per person, 1 kilogram of dal per family. And that was initially supposed to be for a 3-month period, and now it's been extended all the way up to November. Correct. So I am saying, what are your comments on the so-called relief scheme? Because it sounds huge, but you're really repackaging a lot of loan schemes and credit schemes and giving guarantees to credits to micro, small and medium enterprises. And the real additionality of it is perhaps 2 lakh crores instead of 20 lakh crores. Yes, I'd like your comments on the economic, the relief package.
Yes, I mean, that is true. But as you said, that of that relief package, if you actually break it down into 3 parts, which you in a sense alluded to. One part is essentially repackaging of schemes which were already budgeted for. That is, because they were there in the budget presented in February. So you simply pulled out those which were quote unquote a little more populist, and you brought them into the 20 lakh crore package. So that's category 1. Category 2 are the measures that you have taken to give liquidity support to the financial sector and to production units. Right? That's category 2. And category 3 is the net addition to relief, which is what you talked about. And the breakup is that the net addition is about 2 lakh crores. The liquidity support is about 8.5 lakh crores. And the repackaging is almost 10 lakh crores.
Dr. Sen, the question is, you are giving now guarantees, bank loans, you are sweetening them, you are asking small, medium and micro, small, cottage, micro, small, medium enterprises to borrow more from the bank. But why would they borrow more from the bank if you're facing what we earlier discussed, a recessionary situation, which is essentially a demand situation? If what you produce, you don't have buyers for those, then what's the use in taking that loan? Yes, sir.
That is correct. So if you look at the really large item for the MSME sector, which is the unsecured loan, which is 100% guaranteed by the government. So 3 lakh crores had been provided, of which at the moment you have I think the amount of loans that have been approved is about 0.7 lakh crores, and the amount that has been disbursed is only about 0.5. And what one is hearing from the bankers is half that money is not going to be taken up. You are absolutely correct.
Okay. Dr. Sen, the government of India, the central government, is badly strapped for money. And one of the manifestations of how badly it is squeezed for finance or for money is the recent announcement that the states are not going to be reimbursed what they would get under the GST, the Goods and Services Tax. So the situation seems to be very, very, very precarious. The relief measures, the measures to take care of the migrants, all of this has devolved on the states. It's the responsibility of the states. But the central government itself is badly squeezed for fund money and is not now giving that money to states. It took its time in giving the earlier GST dues. So that situation is not at all good for the country's economy. It's pretty terrible, I would say.
It's terrible because, you see, the point is, unless the expenditure takes place, and as you rightly said, the bulk of the expenditure will have to be by the states, because that's where the problem is. The central government can only act as a financier. It cannot directly intervene into the kind of things that you and I are talking about. It has to be from the state. Now, if the states, unlike the center, do face what's called a hard budget constraint, that is, they can spend only what they earn as taxes, B, the amount the center transfers to them as a share of taxes, and 3, the amount they are allowed to borrow. Now, given the slowdown that has taken place, my estimate is that the states have already, mind you, lost about 2.5 lakh crores of taxes. Okay? They have been allowed to borrow 4 lakh crores additionally.
From the Reserve Bank of India.
From the Reserve Bank of India. We've covered only 1/4 of the year. They are going to be out of funds very, very quickly. And if the states are told that you go and borrow even more, it will have a terrible effect on the economy, because what will happen is that the interest rate on state government bonds is going to go through the roof. It will really go high. And because state government bonds are quasi-sovereign, they're virtually risk-free, that will set the benchmark for the interest rate that will be charged on private borrowings, which means that private borrowers will have to pay that much higher interest.
Okay.
Which then means that any hope of an investment revival will simply be nipped in the bud.
Before I ask you what, according to you, needs to be done at this juncture, let me ask you a little bit to elaborate on this whole issue of a fiscal deficit. Now, we already have a Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. Many people argued at that point of time whether it was at all necessary or not. But today, we have a situation where we used to talk about a 3% fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP. And now you're saying it's certainly going to go up hugely, perhaps to 7%, perhaps 8%. But this whole notion of a fiscal deficit being a certain proportion of the GDP, and this is the way to ensure that you don't ensure there are no inflationary pressures, etc., seems to have all completely gone today. I mean, today you have a terrible situation. So where do you think the fiscal deficit would eventually end up?
Well, that depends on the extent to which the central government actually steps up in terms of its spending. At the moment, we are seeing no indication of that. The central government has already announced roughly a 4 lakh crore additional borrowing. over and above what had been budgeted. So it is now going to borrow about 12.5 lakh crores. Right? Now, if that's all it borrows, then the central fiscal deficit will be about 6% of last year's GDP. However, if this year we are going to see a 10% contraction, then that's going to be above 7%.
Okay.
The bigger problem is going to be the states. The states were actually fiscally more responsible than the center was. So they were at about 2.7, 2.8% of GDP, unlike the center, which is 3.8. The states are their fiscal deficits are probably going to go up to 5.5%, maybe even more.
Okay. So if the government hopes to raise resources by privatizing, which is again a controversial move. But if I ask you to sum up your views about what, according to you, needs to be done at this juncture, because the economy has received a huge jolt. Recession, depression, and none of us really know how long this will continue. I mean, I don't think even the Reserve Bank of India knows, and the Reserve Bank of India governor has been repeatedly saying, we don't know. What more, according to you, needs to be done at this juncture to try and reduce the impact of the COVID pandemic and the lockdown on the Indian economy? And what, according to you, what would be your prescriptions at this juncture?
You know, the prescription, I think, is fairly clear, which is that we are staring at a double-digit negative growth of GDP in the current year and a possible further negative growth next year. The government needs to act now so that as the lockdown is lifted across the country, the producers are given sufficient sort of, it's not a guarantee as it were, but confidence that step in terms of higher expenditure, whether it's done by the center itself through infrastructure construction or it is done through the states, that is a matter of detail. But as I said, the states don't have the funds, the center does. Now, the center has to, as I said, already cope with roughly a 3 to 3.5 lakh crore reduction in its taxes. It can borrow possibly about 4.5 lakh from the market. That's what the banks will probably be able to give to the government. The remaining amount will have to be monetized by the Reserve Bank. Now, by monetization, what I mean is that the government, instead of financing its deficit by issuing bonds for the private sector to buy, issues bonds directly to the RBI in exchange for cash.
So in other words, to sort of cut out all the jargon, it's essentially printing more notes.
It's printing more notes. It's printing more notes. One of the positives about printing more notes in this particular situation is that it will put a downward pressure on interest rates. And if you really are serious about reviving investments in the country, that needs to happen. The RBI has done its job. It has brought down the policy rates. So the repo rate is already 4%. It can go down a little bit more, but not a lot. But the market rates continue to be high.
And to explain,
because the interest rate on government bonds is too high.
Yeah, to explain what is a repo rate, that's the repo is a short form of repurchase option. That is the rate at which banks borrow money from the central bank, short-term borrowings, overnight borrowings, as they call it. Yes, sir. So if you can conclude your remarks at this juncture, you think that there's no other way out, but essentially for the Reserve Bank of India to print more notes, the government to monetize its I mean, to spend more. spend as much
No,
as
that's right. In fact, you're getting it from the other side. It is that the government needs to spend a lot more. I would say that over and above what they have already planned, they need to spend about 4 to 5 lakh crores. And that additional expenditure will need to be financed through monetization by the RBI.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sen, for explaining in detail the current state of India's economy. And you've just heard and watched the former Chief Statistician of India and the Chairman of the National Statistical Commission explain the details, the intricacies of the state of India's economy. Thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure.